She inherited an abandoned ranch and thought it was just an ordinary farm. But when she opened the barn, she found something that changed her entire life. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new stories, and leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. Emma Gray had never imagined that her life, so meticulously managed around small budgets and the avoidance of unnecessary risks, could shift because of one envelope. Yet as she lay awake in her rented studio apartment, staring at the cracks on the ceiling illuminated by the neon glow of a sign outside, she felt the presence of change like a weight sitting on her chest. Only a day earlier, she would have described her life as predictable in the dullest way. She spent her mornings sending out resumes into the digital void, hoping that someone, somewhere, might notice her experience and overlook the employment gaps and temporary contracts that spoke of a life spent surviving rather than rising. Her afternoons were devoted to hustling between part-time gigs that kept the lights on and the landlord satisfied. Evenings were a long stretch of quiet where she tried not to think too hard about the bills waiting like wolves just outside her door. Her phone screen was crowded with reminders, overdue notices, interest fees ticking upward, polite warnings with undertones that felt increasingly sharp. Student loans lingered like ghosts from a younger, more hopeful version of herself. Her job at the cafe had been cut to partial hours after another chain store opened nearby. Her last relationship had dissolved during an argument about priorities, his voice echoing in her memory. "You always act like you're drowning, Emma. When are you going to swim?" It was cruel, but a part of her worried he was right. She was not swimming. She was barely treading water. That was the life she knew when the letter arrived. A thick envelope with embossed lettering and an unfamiliar law firm's logo. She almost didn't open it, assuming it was another promotional trap dressed up in importance, but curiosity nudged her fingers to slide across the paper, tearing it open. Her eyes passed over the formalities and landed on the words that made her sit up sharply. "You are the sole heir to the property formerly owned by your distant relative, Mr. William Gray." Property, heir, sole. The terms looked like they had wandered into her life from someone else's vocabulary. She read and reread the letter, waiting for the mistake to appear. The property, a ranch and farmland located far from the city, hundreds of acres and multiple structures, had been left entirely to her. The name pricked at something dim in her memory, a half-forgotten mention from childhood holidays. An eccentric uncle, or maybe a cousin of her father's, someone who lived alone and disliked visitors. She had never met him. They had not exchanged Christmas cards. She could not recall his face or even the sound of his name spoken aloud. Why her? Why now? Her first instinct was suspicion. Was this some kind of scam? But the letter included contact information for a licensed attorney, full details of the estate, and instructions outlining a straightforward legal process. There was nothing threatening or demanding, just an invitation to claim what was already hers. It didn't make sense. Nothing in her life had ever arrived without strings attached. She placed the letter carefully on the small kitchen table and stepped away from it as if it might explode. The apartment felt suddenly too tight, the air thick. She brewed cheap coffee to steady her nerves, but her hands shook anyway as she lifted the mug. The possibilities cascaded into her imagination. A house, land, space that belonged to her, a chance to start again. Or maybe just something she could sell to pay for a fresh start. Yet fear threaded through her excitement. Leaving the city meant stepping into an unknown place where she knew no one. What if the house was falling apart? What if the land was worthless? What if she discovered a burden disguised as a gift? Her life had taught her caution. Hope was a luxury she could barely afford. But as she lay in bed that night, sleep refusing to come, she found herself staring at the shadows on the wall and thinking, maybe this is the change I've been waiting for. By morning, she had made up her mind. She could not in good conscience ignore an opportunity that might never come again. She reached out to the attorney, spoke with a calm voice that did not match her fluttering heart, and arranged to visit the property. The estate's location surprised her, deep in rural terrain, far past the maps of suburban expansion, somewhere that looked like it had slipped through time's attention. The journey took more planning and money than she wanted to spend. She packed lightly, stuffing essentials into a single duffel bag, making mental lists of everything she might need if the property wasn't livable. When she boarded the first bus heading out of the city, she felt the strange sensation of leaving behind her old self sitting on a cracked plastic bench at a bus stop. Miles began to unspool behind her. The skyline shrank. Strip malls gave way to cornfields, then rolling grassland, then long stretches of highway, where the only living things seemed to be the wind and the occasional hawk sailing above the road. The farther she traveled, the quieter her phone became. Bars of reception disappeared, notifications ceased. The absence of constant digital noise left her uneasy, but also strangely free. She watched the landscape change under the fading pulse of cell signal, watched the pastures stretch wide like a deep breath drawn by the earth itself. She was no longer drowning in concrete and deadlines. For the first time in a long while, she could see clouds drifting unhurriedly across open skies. When the bus finally dropped her at a modest station in a small town, the silence felt alive. A beat-up taxi carried her the rest of the way down a long dirt road that rattled her bones and set dust swirling in the afternoon sunlight. At last, they arrived at a gate of rust-bitten iron, hanging slightly crooked from its hinges. A faded sign once painted with the farm's name was now little more than splintered wood, but the letters Gray Ranch could still be guessed at if one squinted. The taxi driver unloaded her bag and wished her luck in a tone that suggested she would need it. Then the car rolled away, leaving Emma alone in a landscape that seemed to exhale with every gust of wind. She pushed open the gate and stepped onto the property that was now somehow her own. The house came into view first, a two-story farmhouse that must have been handsome once, its white paint now weathered and peeling. Windows shuttered tightly, as though keeping secrets trapped inside. The porch sagged slightly and a swing hung motionless from rusty chains. The yard was a tangle of weeds and wild grass that brushed her knees as she walked. Then she saw the barn. It stood farther back on the property, larger than she expected. The wood was dark with age, the roof patched unevenly with tin sheets that caught the sunlight. The massive sliding doors were secured with a heavy iron padlock, far too sturdy and modern to match the rest of the building. Something about that lock unsettled her. It wasn't neglect, it was protection. Her footsteps slowed as she took in the details. Fresh tire tracks near the barn's entrance. A section of fence broken recently enough that the wood looked pale and splintered. A discarded glove lying near the gate, its fabric clean despite the surrounding dust. These were signs of recent activity, contradicting the appearance of abandonment. Her instincts tightened into a knot. Someone had been here, not weeks or months ago, days, maybe even hours. Inside the house, the atmosphere thickened further. The air was stale, heavy with dust and the scent of old timber. Furniture sat exactly where someone had last used it. A sweater draped over the back of a chair, a cup beside the sink with a faint brown ring at the bottom, a calendar on the wall frozen on a date nearly 3 years past. There was no sign of a farewell, no careful packing away of belongings. It looked as though the owner had stepped out and simply never returned. A loneliness hung in the rooms like old curtains, and yet there was another feeling beneath it, something harder to name. A presence, not supernatural, but deeply human, the residue of a mind burdened by secrets. Emma explored slowly, palms brushing the wallpaper that curled away from the plaster, eyes lingering on family photographs that never appeared. There were landscapes, animals, distant faces captured in crowds, but none showing the man who had lived here, none showing relatives. Whoever William Gray had been, he had kept his life pressed tight like a sealed envelope. Night crept upon her while she unpacked what little she had brought. The silence outside felt mammoth, broken only by the rustle of the wind through the fields and the occasional moan of old wooden beams shifting in the dark. Sleep came reluctantly. Each time she closed her eyes, she saw that locked barn and wondered why a farmer would guard an empty building so fiercely. The house creaked and breathed in the night like a restless animal. Several times she sat upright in bed, convinced she had heard footsteps outside, or the metallic clink of a chain swaying against a post. But when she went to the window, nothing moved except shadows. Though exhaustion eventually claimed her, Emma's dreams were tangled with the same question that pulsed through her waking thoughts. Why had this place been left to her, a stranger in blood and heart? And what lay waiting beyond the locked doors of the barn? Morning would come with fragile light stretching across the neglected fields. Morning would bring her back to that unanswered question, and morning would push her one step closer to the secret that had called her here long before she ever knew this ranch existed. She was not ready for the truth, but the truth was already awake, waiting for her, sealed behind steel and time. The morning light crept gently into Emma's room, peeling away the shadows that had stretched long and ominous during the night. She awoke with a tightness in her chest, the remnants of uneasy dreams still clinging to her mind like cobwebs. For a few disoriented seconds, she forgot where she was, expecting to see the familiar outline of her cramped apartment. Instead, she was greeted by peeling wallpaper, warped floorboards, and the faint scent of aged dust and timber. The silence around her was so complete that it felt like a presence in its own right. The ranch wasn't just quiet, it was listening. She dressed with a slow, deliberate pace, as if giving herself time to adjust to this unfamiliar reality. The quiet kitchen offered little comfort, an old refrigerator that hummed weakly, a sink stained from years of minerals in the water, cabinets nearly empty except for a few canned goods she had brought along. There was no welcome here, only vacancy and the faint echo of a life interrupted. After forcing herself to eat something small, she returned to the task she'd abandoned the night before, understanding the house and the history she had inherited. She walked from room to room, opening drawers, flipping through stray papers, stepping lightly as though afraid she might disturb something that should remain at rest. Each room seemed to whisper fragments of the man who had lived here, papers detailing expenses for fencing and grain, receipts from a local hardware store, brochures for farming equipment. But the more she found, the less she understood about him. Most striking of all was the absence of personal mementos. There were no wedding photos, no evidence of family visits, no smiling faces captured over holiday dinners. It was as if her uncle, though she struggled to think of him as family, had scrubbed his life clean of any personal connection. The closest thing she found to sentimentality were 3 framed landscapes on the living room wall. Endless fields under stormy skies. They could have been paintings of this very ranch, long before time and neglect had worn it down. The calendar in the kitchen drew her back repeatedly. Its last date was circled in red, but the reason for that emphasis had been lost. She traced her finger across the printed numbers, noting that the days following had been left empty, unwritten, unimagined. Something about that abrupt halt chilled her. It was not the natural end of routine, it was a life stopped mid-sentence. Needing air and sunlight, she stepped outside, blinking into the bright morning as a breeze tugged at her hair. The sky above stretched wide and endless, reminding her of just how small she suddenly felt. She wandered toward the road, drawn by the faint hope of encountering another human soul. Someone who knew the truth of this place, someone who could help her piece together the missing story. It was a long walk into the nearby town, each crunch of gravel under her shoes reinforcing the isolation of the ranch. The roadside weeds swayed as she passed, as though bowing to a stranger who did not yet belong. When she reached the main street, she found a handful of shops, a diner with a sun-faded awning, a grocery store the size of a city apartment, a hardware store that smelled of oil and sawdust even from outside. People watched her with the curiosity usually reserved for drifters and outsiders. She reminded herself that in a place this small, news traveled faster than cars. Inside the diner, eyes followed her as she slid into a booth. The waitress, a woman whose wrinkles carried stories of work and weather, approached with a pot of coffee and a cautious smile. Emma forced her own lips into something resembling pleasantness and ordered breakfast, though she wasn't sure she could eat much. She made gentle attempts at conversation, asking about the ranch, about her uncle. Responses came in fragments, some polite, some reluctant. He was quiet, kept to himself, hard-working. A little unusual. A man who didn't enjoy company, especially not in his later years. People shrugged a lot as they spoke, as if trying to brush off memories they didn't want to dwell on. When Emma asked whether anyone knew why he had left the property in her name, there were only more shrugs and speculative glances. One man at the counter muttered that outsiders didn't need to know everything. Another whispered to his friend, too quietly for Emma to hear clearly, though she caught the word trouble. A younger woman behind the counter chimed in that, "Sometimes people hide from their lives in the only place that still feels safe, home." Emma left with more questions than answers. Still, she had confirmed one thing. The story of her uncle's final years was not a simple one, and the town preferred it that way. The sun was warmer when she stepped outside again, though the chill inside her persisted, an uneasy thread pulling her thoughts toward the locked barn she had seen yesterday. She walked the long path back to the ranch with the weight of those curious looks gnawing at her. Her gaze kept drifting toward the distant silhouette of the barn, dark and stern against the otherwise open landscape. It was too heavily secured to be a storage space for tools or hay. The lock was industrial, the metal thick, the hinges reinforced. It was a building meant to conceal, not shelter livestock or farming equipment. Approaching the barn now, she scanned its exterior for clues she might have missed before. The wood was weathered but strong, bearing the scars of time without yielding to it. She noticed what looked like the remnants of an old security camera bracket, rusted and empty. The suggestion of previous surveillance unsettled her. Why would a secluded farmer need such precautions? Her pulse quickened as she tugged at the large padlock. It didn't budge. She tried looking for another entry point, circling the structure carefully. Behind it, where the grass had grown high enough to brush her waist, she found footprints. Heavy, recent, leading toward and away from the barn. Not hers, not old. Someone had been here. Her heart pounded louder than the wind. Whoever had visited might return. Maybe they were watching already. The sensation of invisible eyes on her back pushed her to retreat toward the house. But fear was soon overtaken by determination. This inheritance wasn't a gift. It was a responsibility. One she needed to understand. She refused to be intimidated by shadows and stray marks in the dirt. If the barn held answers, she would uncover them. Inside the house, she searched every room for anything resembling tools or spare keys. In a hallway closet, she found an old toolbox thick with dust. Most contents were rusted, but a sturdy crowbar remained intact, and she tucked it under her arm. In a storage room attached to the kitchen, she discovered another metal cabinet secured by a simple latch. Its shelves held folded tarps, worn rope, and a heavy-duty flashlight whose battery still had life. She gathered these things and felt the faint thrill of progress ignite inside her. Near the bottom of the cabinet lay a series of spiral notebooks, stained and dog-eared from handling. She carried them to the table, brushing off grime. The handwriting inside was tight and cramped. Lines packed with lists of numbers, initials, brief notes that meant nothing to her. Dates spanned years. Some entries correlated with articles she had seen in town outbreaks of burglaries, missing persons, rumors that had floated briefly through the headlines. Others referenced equipment deliveries, times, and something called inventory. The word made her uneasy when she saw it repeated next to large sums of cash. Her uncle had kept records too careful, too organized for the mundane responsibilities of ranch life. The sun was dipping lower when she decided she couldn't wait another day. Armed with the flashlight, crowbar, and a resolve inspired partly by fear and partly by curiosity, she marched back outside. The barn stood waiting, silent and immense. She pressed her palm against the door, feeling the chill of the metal. The padlock mocked her, but she was done waiting. She wedged the crowbar under the edge of the lock, pushing with all her strength. Metal groaned, resisting fiercely. Her muscles burned with effort. Sweat prickled her brow. Finally, something gave way. Not fully, but enough to rattle the door on its tracks. The lock remained stubborn, but now she could see that the hasp securing it had loosened. She attacked it again, and with a jarring snap, the metal plate tore free from the wood. The door slid open a few inches, releasing a gust of air that smelled of stale straw, rusted mechanics, and something darker oil and disuse, layered thick. Emma paused, letting her eyes adjust before pushing the door wider. The barn yawned open into shadow. Dust motes drifted in the air, swirling in the slice of light from the doorway. She stepped inside slowly, her boots crunching on scattered debris. The beam of her flashlight cut across piles of old farming tools, coiled wire, and rusted equipment. Wooden crates were stacked haphazardly along the wall, marked with faint labels from long-forgotten shipments. A canvas tarp hung over something massive in the corner, weighted at the edges as though someone wanted to ensure it stayed hidden. Emma approached cautiously, heart hammering. She reached for the tarp and tugged. Beneath the canvas stood a colossal metal safe. It was taller than she was, its surface scarred by years of neglect and transport. The once green paint had faded and cracked, revealing iron beneath. Its door bore a circular dial, the numbers nearly worn away, and a thick steel handle positioned like a locked fist. It looked ancient, but strong. It looked like it belonged in a bank vault, not a barn in the countryside. She stood there, the flashlight trembling in her hand, uncertainty rippling through her. Who installs a safe like this on a ranch? What was inside that required such security? Why did it loom over her like a silent guardian or a silent threat? Her breath caught as another realization slithered into her thoughts. This wasn't a secret someone forgot to collect. It was a secret someone intended to return for. And Emma was no longer an outsider to it. Her inheritance, she now understood, was not land and buildings. It was mystery. It was danger. It was the burden of unfinished business placed squarely into her hesitant hands. Fear urged her to close the barn door and walk away, pretend she never saw what lay beneath that tarp. But somewhere deeper inside, in a place long starved of purpose, something else stirred a desire to know the truth, to claim the narrative she'd been thrust into. She stepped closer to the safe, running her hand along the cold metal. Dust clung to her fingertips. The faint indentations of numbers around the dial hinted that the right combination still lay hidden somewhere in the scattered clues left behind. Her uncle had locked away more than valuables here. He had locked a story in steel. The safe waited, unmoving yet expectant, as if it had been waiting just for her. Emma backed away slowly, the barn's shadows growing longer as evening crept in. She turned off the flashlight and stepped out into what remained of the daylight. The barn door slid shut with a groan, and she reattached the lock as best she could, though it no longer held nearly as strong. There was no going back now. The silence of the ranch felt heavier as she walked away, as though the land itself was holding its breath alongside her. The house loomed ahead, but the barn pulled her thoughts behind like gravity. What her uncle had left was more than an inheritance. It was a challenge, a warning, an invitation. Tonight she would sleep, knowing the truth was locked inside a vault just a few paces away. Tomorrow she would begin the task of opening it. The ranch had been silent for years. Now that she was here, it seemed ready to speak. She woke before dawn, unsure whether she had slept at all or merely drifted in and out of anxious consciousness. The house was still, its silence thick as she sat up and looked toward the window, where a thin ribbon of gray light seeped through the curtain. The presence of the barn weighed on her mind with the heaviness of something waiting in the dark. The discovery of the massive vault inside had lodged itself in her thoughts like a stubborn knot she couldn't loosen. She felt an urgency, an invisible hand pushing her forward even as fear tugged her back. The morning air was sharp and cool when she stepped outside. A quiet fog clung low across the fields, softening the edges of the world, making the barn seem even more imposing in its silhouette. She paused on the porch, watching the shadows shift as daylight tried to claim the land from the night. Her breath formed faint clouds before her lips, fading quickly like fleeting resolve. Yesterday's curiosity had hardened into something stronger. She needed to understand what that vault meant, not only to the ranch, but to the life she had stumbled into by inheritance. Still, the unknown pressed in around her, whispering caution. She forced herself to move, drawn again to the barn's looming presence. Inside, the stale air hit her, dust, rust, and memories too heavy to dissipate. She approached the safe with renewed determination, but the unbreakable door seemed to stare back as if guarding its own soul. She knew she couldn't open it yet, not without more information, not without unraveling the logic within her uncle's coded notes. It was too much guesswork and not enough truth. The safe wasn't going to surrender easily, so instead, she turned to everything around it. The clutter suddenly felt purposeful rather than accidental. She swept her flashlight beam across old crates marked with faint stencils, digging through them one by one. Inside lay corroded tools, spare parts, bolts, and weather-worn tarps, not much to decipher. Yet something about the structured disarray spoke of a man who lived in constant anticipation of needing to hide, relocate, or protect what he held. Back in the house, she resumed her search through the notebooks and records. She laid them out across the dining table, flipping through pages filled with meticulous handwriting. Her uncle had cataloged dates and initials, listed payments and locations in short, cryptic bursts. Words like drop and delivery, followed by large sums, stood out in stark ink. A few entries were underlined, accompanied by question marks, as if he had begun to doubt those he'd been involved with. There were notes referencing warehouses, police precincts, abandoned lots. None of it resembled the mundane life of a farmer. A newspaper clipping slipped from between two pages. Emma picked it up, smoothing its wrinkled surface. The article was about a local police investigation and officer accused of evidence tampering and suspicious financial dealings. The case had never gone to trial, and all charges were dropped without explanation. The date on the clipping fell squarely within one of the notebook's timelines. When she scanned the list again, her heart quickened. The same initials appeared beside several figures in the ledger. More clippings followed. Thefts that were never solved, missing persons whose stories faded from the headlines too soon, a string of robberies where cash was stolen but valuables left behind. Each was marked with notes in her uncle's hand. All the threads pointed to crime operating in silence, just beneath the veneer of law and order in this quiet region. And somehow her uncle had been in the center of the web, either caught in it or weaving it himself. Her stomach churned with unease. The man whose property she inherited, who in the legal words was family, had led a life enshrouded in secrecy and peril. It dawned on her that if these records were accurate, the safe might contain far more devastating proof. Documents capable of toppling powerful individuals or exposing networks that depended on shadows. Money and jewels could be sold or stored. Blackmail material had the power to break lives. Emma rubbed her temples, the weight of discovery growing heavier by the minute. She wondered what kind of man her uncle had been. Had he been a criminal profiteer, hoarding illicit wealth like a dragon in a lonely lair? Or had he gathered evidence against corrupt people, preparing to reveal truth but never getting the chance? Was the safe a vault of greed or of justice stuck in limbo? As she pondered these questions, the crunch of gravel outside snapped her head up. A vehicle slowed near the front of the property. She darted to the window, carefully lifting the curtain just an inch. A dark pickup sat idling at the entrance gate. She recognized it. She'd seen something like it circling the area when the taxi dropped her off the day before, and again when she returned from town. The driver remained inside, face obscured by shadows, staring directly toward the house. Her throat tightened. After a long moment, the truck began to reverse, its tires rolling backward without hurry. The driver didn't turn around or speed as though caught in wrongdoing. He simply left, still watching until trees and distance hid him from sight. The message was clear enough. Someone was checking on her. Someone cared very much about what happened on this land. Fear prickled her skin. Was the driver a neighbor, concerned and curious, or someone connected to the secrets in the barn? She stepped away from the window, pulse racing. Something had shifted with her arrival. Her presence had stirred the dust of old trouble. For the rest of the day, nervous anticipation buzzed under her skin. Every soundbird's landing on the roof, branches brushing the siding, the whine of wind made her flinch. But fear alone could not stop her now. The truth had hooked her, dragging her forward. By afternoon, she returned to the barn again with the notes in hand. She knelt beside the vault and studied the dial. The safe was mechanical, old enough to require articulated precision rather than any digital key. It spoke in clicks, in friction, in subtle resistance. Her uncle had likely opened it many times. His combination existed somewhere in his obsessive scrawlings. But before she could dive into combinations and theories, another question demanded attention. Who had last tried to access this safe? She examined its edges with renewed caution and noticed faint scratches, fresh ones, around the dial's housing. The metal bore marks from recent attempts to pry the mechanism or drill through the lock. They looked like they had been made in haste. For a second, nausea rose in her throat. Someone had tried to break into this safe and had failed. Someone who might not have realized her uncle had died. Someone who didn't know she now stood between them and the vault's contents. Night crept near once more. She locked the barn as best she could, glancing over her shoulder with every step. The weight of isolation, once refreshing, had become suffocating. Back inside, she searched for a place where her uncle might have hidden something more personal, something directed to her. It took hours of searching through drawers and shelves before she found a small wooden box beneath a stack of brittle receipts. The lid stuck slightly, but inside lay a sealed envelope bearing her name. Her pulse hammered as she tore it open. The letter inside was brief, written in the same firm hand as the notebooks. He apologized for not being part of her life, admitted that his distance had been a protective measure for both of them. He warned that if she was reading this, then the worst had already happened. There were those who believed they owned what he had secured in the safe. There were those who would do anything to reclaim it. It wasn't money he feared losing. It was truth. He wrote that he had gathered everything necessary to expose individuals who had corrupted laws, stolen justice, and used violence to maintain their power. He had begun to doubt his allies, sensing betrayal circling closer. There was no one he could trust, so he hoped that someone with nothing to gain and no allegiance to the past, someone like her, might finish what he could not. She must decide, destroy everything and walk away free, or take the risk to bring hidden wrongs into the light. Her hands shook as she lowered the letter. She wanted to deny what she had read, but the evidence around her refused to allow disbelief. She replayed the sight of the man in the truck, the marks on the safe, the uneasy tone of the townsfolk when speaking of her uncle. She was already part of the story. Nightfall arrived thick and dark. She bolted the doors of the house and double-checked the windows. Her mind swirled with possibilities. Should she leave now before it was too late? Should she call the authorities? Though how could she be sure who was trustworthy if law enforcement itself might be entangled in the corruption her uncle had tracked? Was she willing to risk her safety for truths buried in a vault? Sleep was impossible. She sat by the kitchen table, the dim lamp casting long shadows, staring at the assembled clues. Fear told her to escape while she could. Conscience told her some wrongs demanded courage to confront, and curiosity, dangerous, insistent curiosity, told her that destiny had brought her here for a reason. After midnight, she heard an unmistakable sound, footsteps outside, heavy and slow, brushing gravel. She froze. Silence followed, then the faint metallic click of something being tested. Her breath caught. Someone was trying the barn door. She stood motionless for what felt like hours. Eventually the noises faded. A car engine hummed to life. She dared only a fleeting glance through the curtain and caught the retreating glow of headlights disappearing into the night. Emma's heart pounded painfully. There was no doubt left. She was being watched. She was not alone on this ranch, and the watchers cared only for what lay inside the safe. The next morning, exhaustion painted everything in darker shades, but resolve hardened in her eyes. She could not simply walk away now. The inheritance she had received was not one of comfort, but of unfinished purpose. Running would not protect her, not when they already knew she was here. So she made a decision. She would find the truth inside that vault, understand the full weight of the legacy she'd been given, and only then decide what must be done. Her uncle had trusted her. Maybe she didn't yet understand why, but she could not betray that fragile trust just because she was afraid. The safe, the records, the hidden network, they all called her forward. Even the danger felt strangely clarifying. For the first time in years, she was doing more than surviving. She had a mission, whether she asked for one or not. Emma gathered the notebooks, the letter, and all the courage she could collect from her trembling bones. The ranch was no longer merely a place left behind by a man she never knew. It had become a crossroads in her life. One path led toward anonymity and safety. The other led deeper into the shadows her uncle had lived among. Shadows that demanded light. She looked toward the barn once more through the kitchen window. The early sun glinted weakly off the metal roof. Somewhere within its walls was truth rotted, dangerous, and powerful. A truth that no one ever intended for her to find, but she would find it anyway. The rain rolled in before dawn, a soft patter against the house that slowly grew into a steadier rhythm. Emma woke to the sound, disoriented at first, then fully aware of where she was and what waited for her outside. The letter she had read last night lay open on the kitchen table, its message as stark in daylight as it had been in the dark. She stared at it with a mixture of disbelief and determination, feeling the weight of the pages increase the longer she looked. The world outside the window was muted by gray clouds and drifting mist. Water pooled in the ruts along the driveway. The fields bowed under the touch of passing wind. It was the kind of weather that encouraged staying inside, making tea, pretending the world could wait. But nothing about Emma's situation could wait. She had the distinct feeling that time was no longer on her side. The barn had become the center of her thoughts, drawing her like a magnet. As she looked at the tools scattered across the counter, screwdrivers, pliers, wrenches, she realized she needed a better approach to the safe. The notebooks and cryptic records had to hold something more than simple ledgers. They had been written by a man meticulous enough to keep the truth hidden behind steel. Surely he had also hidden the key to unlocking it. She spent hours hunched over the pages again, scanning lines until the numbers began to blur. She jotted down anything that repeated: dates, coordinates, license plate fragments, and lists that looked like transaction ledgers. One particular sequence of digits surfaced again and again, always accompanied by a set of initials and occasionally a stern underline. It looked important. It felt important. She circled it, hoping it might point her in the right direction. The morning bled into afternoon while she worked, barely noticing the hunger gnawing at her stomach. Every creak of the house sounded like an intruder. Every passing vehicle on the far road made her glance nervously toward the window. She could not shake the feeling that someone else was waiting for her to slip up, to unlock the safe for them, unknowingly delivering danger into her own hands. Determined not to be intimidated, she bundled herself in a worn jacket she had found in the bedroom closet and stepped onto the porch. The rain had eased, leaving the ground damp and fragrant. Her boots sank softly into the mud as she crossed the yard. Crowbar gripped tightly. The barn door let out a long groan when she slid it open again, as if annoyed at being disturbed twice in as many days. The air inside felt colder today, as though the safe's looming presence had chilled the entire building. Emma switched on the flashlight and moved closer to the vault, kneeling beside the dial. She hesitated before touching it, as though contact would make everything irrevocably real. Then she twisted the numbers she had isolated from the notebooks, a long, methodical rotation of the wheel, stopping precisely with the care of someone guided more by instinct than experience. Click. She froze. The soft sound was unmistakable. Hope flared, bright and reckless. She continued, guided by memory and the rhythm of numbers that had repeated in the margins of her uncle's planning. Left, right, left. Hold breath. A second click, deeper this time, resonating through the metal shell like a muffled heartbeat. The dial stopped moving, so freely settling into place, as though aligning with long dormant gears. Her hand moved to the handle. Every nerve in her arm tingled as she pulled. Resistance met her first, then slowly, achingly, it gave way. The door groaned outward, releasing a cloud of stale air that smelled of old paper and iron. She exhaled shakily, hardly believing what she had done. The safe stood open. Inside, shelves lined the space from top to bottom. Some held dusty stacks of bills bound with cracking rubber bands. Others contained rectangular envelopes and manila folders packed thick with documents. At the bottom sat containers, small heavy boxes with tarnished locks, and a compact recorder whose blinking light told her it still had power left to give. Her pulse thumped wildly as her eyes moved over the wealth, the evidence, the mysterious relics of a life that had been far from ordinary. The first bills she touched felt gritty with dust. They were older, their green faded slightly, but unmistakably real. An entire shelf of money, and that was only the beginning. Jewelry cases nestled beneath the stacks, rings heavy with stones. A necklace that glittered even under the dim light. A watch crafted with such precision she could see tiny gears pulsing behind its face. These were items of value, stolen or seized. It was difficult to tell. They could buy her 100 fresh starts. But she knew these objects were mere shadows of the truth, meaningless beside the pile of folders, marked with the names of people who had lived their lives believing their secrets buried. She picked one folder at random, feeling the weight of it before she dared open it. Inside were photographs, aerial shots of warehouses, parking lots, and intersections she didn't yet recognize. Attached were handwritten notes, never complete sentences, always fragments, as though thoughts had been captured hastily. Some photos included figures circled in red ink. She didn't know their faces, but she understood the implication. They were targets, or villains, or victims. In a world like this one, roles could easily shift from one to another. Certain documents bore official seals, classified markings struck through with marker to indicate they had been removed from rightful control. Many sheets had lines redacted, but what remained was damning enough. Signatures of law enforcement officers, timestamps of surveillance operations gone wrong, unauthorized exchanges of funds through anonymous accounts. These were the thorns embedded deep beneath polished surfaces of power. Her uncle had collected this. Why? To expose corruption? To defend himself? Or to protect someone else? It was impossible to tell yet, but one undeniable truth stood out. He had been involved in something far more dangerous than Emma had been prepared to face. Her knees weakened slightly and she sat back on the barn floor, overwhelmed. There was enough here to change lives, to ruin careers, to make enemies very bold or very desperate. She realized with sudden clarity that opening the safe wasn't the hardest part of this inheritance. It was deciding what to do now that she knew. The barn seemed to shift subtly as a breeze rattled the loosened door. The world outside remained quiet, but Emma couldn't shake the sensation that someone had crossed an invisible line with her. With the vault now open, the danger was no longer theoretical. It had entered her life fully. She gathered a smaller number of documents and items, enough to study further without exposing everything at once. The safe door was heavy, and she closed it gently, its final thud echoing like the end of a heartbeat. She hadn't locked it again. She needed the option to return quickly without alerting anyone watching her. Inside the house, she spread the collected folders across the dining table once more. The visual chaos of papers and photographs painted a clearer picture this time. Money flowing from drug operations and unregistered land deals. Swap points where unmarked vehicles exchanged parcels under cover of darkness. One entry listed a coded location Emma recognized from a map she had passed during her drive. An abandoned industrial yard near the next town. Names she remembered from the newspaper clippings emerged again, their initials repeated alongside dates and dollar amounts. Her uncle had been tracking a corruption network one that infected police forces, local government, maybe even judicial offices. He had kept every shred of evidence he collected. Perhaps he had hoped the safe would keep him alive until the right moment arrived. Perhaps that moment never came. Rain continued tapping the windows, threatening to lull her into forgetting the gravity of her situation. She ran a trembling hand through her hair, trying to calculate her next move. Her ladder of priorities rearranged itself. First, she needed help from someone trustworthy, someone who could authenticate what she had found without alerting the wrong people. Second, she needed to secure what remained in the safe from prying eyes. Third, and this part frightened her most, she had to accept that her life was already entangled in the consequences of the truth she had touched. She thought of the truck she had seen, the footprints behind the barn, the whispered caution at the diner. People knew. They were waiting. They likely believed she would fail as her uncle did. They might be planning to intervene before she got too far. She couldn't rely on local authorities, not when some of the files suggested law enforcement officers had ties to the crimes. Nor could she simply pack a bag and run, not without leaving behind the very evidence her uncle had risked everything to gather. Her gaze fell to a small metal box she hadn't opened yet. It was lighter than she expected, but something rattled inside. She found a key taped under the handle, a detail that made her smile despite the tension humming through her veins. Her uncle had been careful, thoughtful even in secrecy. When she opened the lid, she found a collection of keys, small silver ones, brass ones with worn teeth, and a few that looked meant for padlocks or vehicle ignitions. At the bottom was a flash drive and a folded note. She unfolded it carefully, half expecting another warning. Instead, it said only, "Start here. Trust no one too quickly." That was all. No signature necessary. She held the flash drive like a fragile thing, turning it over in her hand. Technology might bridge the gap between her own inexperience and the depth of this conspiracy. If the files inside the safe were the bones of the truth, then this device might contain the nerve center. She found the old laptop again, one she had nearly forgotten in the frenzy of discovery. Its screen flickered awake reluctantly, like a tired old man forced from bed. She hesitated before plugging the device in. Once she accessed its contents, there was no unlearning them. But ignorance had ceased to be an option the moment the safe had groaned open. Now she had responsibility. The folder structure on the flash drive was straightforward, belying the complexity of what lay inside. Labeled categories matched the initials found in the notebooks: corrupt officials, compromised officers, criminal associates. Some files were audio recordings. Others were scanned statements or hidden camera photographs. The deeper she dove, the clearer the story became. Her uncle had worked as an asset to investigators, either officially at some point or independently. He had discovered that the corruption he was tasked to expose reached higher than anyone wanted to admit. When he tried turning in evidence, it vanished. When he reported witnesses, they disappeared. Protectors turned predators. And eventually, he did the only thing left: move the most damning pieces far beyond the reach of the corrupt. He built a vault around the truth, fortified with fear and isolation. But isolation hadn't saved him. Emma closed the laptop, feeling the weight of revelation settle on her shoulders. Her uncle had tried to do the right thing. Now, fate had placed that burden in her hands. She thought of the woman she had been only a week ago, overworked, overlooked, clinging to hope with frayed fingernails. That woman seemed impossibly distant now. She had stepped into a different world, one where silence was dangerous and knowledge was a shield. Night approached slowly, letting the sky bleed from gray into indigo. She forced herself to eat something, though each bite tasted like cardboard. She double-checked the locks again, then a third time. When the wind brushed against the house, she imagined footsteps. When lightning flashed, she pictured lenses glinting from the darkness. She had to act quickly. But what came next required caution. She couldn't afford a mistake. She gathered everything into a neat pile: files, flash drive, letter, and placed them inside a duffel bag she could keep close. She checked her phone for signal. Still nothing. It didn't matter. Tomorrow she would drive into town and find a connection. Find someone she could trust just enough to listen. She would make copies, send them to multiple places, scatter the truth far and wide so it could not be erased again. And then she would decide what to do with the safe's remaining contents. The money, the valuables. They were now a question of morality and survival. What she chose there could shape the rest of her life. Rain continued against the roof, like soft pounding, clarifying her thoughts. She lay in bed staring at the ceiling again, but the cracks no longer reminded her of the ceilings she used to view as the limits of her world. Now they looked like pathways branching into unknowns she was brave enough or foolish enough to follow. Her uncle's voice echoed in the silence, not in sound, but in the gravity of his final message. The truth did not want to stay buried. It had found a new keeper. And tomorrow she would take the first step into a future that frightened her deeper than any debt or disappointment ever had. Morning arrived reluctantly, the heavy clouds clinging low over the land, as though trying to keep daylight from intruding. Emma's eyes opened to the familiar tension already coiled inside her chest. She had slept poorly again, every creak of the house magnified into a threat. As she sat up, she clutched the notebook and letter she had fallen asleep rereading, her fingers stiff from gripping them too tightly. A part of her wished that opening her eyes would reveal this all as some wild illusion. But reality waited, cold and insistent. She forced herself up, moving like someone twice her age. The air inside the ranch house still felt stale, as if memories had been sealed in rather than aired out. While making coffee, she paused by the window, peering outside at the barn through streaks of condensation on the glass. The presence of the safe inside felt like a heartbeat beneath the soil, steady and inescapable. She needed to get to town, to find a reliable internet connection, to copy evidence, and possibly find someone to trust. That decision was no longer negotiable. She packed the duffel bag carefully, ensuring the flash drive, the most crucial documents, and the letter remained with her at all times. Before stepping out, she double-checked the envelopes and a few photographs she added last minute. She didn't want any single piece left behind if she had to run. But leaving the ranch suddenly felt like abandoning a post. Like the moment she disappeared from sight, someone would swoop in and take everything she had uncovered. A chilling thought struck. What if they were waiting for that exact moment? The silence pressed in as she lingered, unable to take that first step outside. She feared both staying and leaving, trapped between danger lurking outside and danger boxed in steel. A sudden pounding at the front door shattered the stillness. She froze, heartbeat slamming against her ribs. The knock came again, harder this time. Panic surged. Had the men in the truck come back? Had someone been watching and timed their arrival to her most vulnerable moment? The third knock echoed through her bones. After a painful stretch of silence, a voice called out from the other side, muffled but familiar enough to halt Emma's mounting terror. "Miss Hayes, it's Sheriff Dalton. I'd like a word with you." Her pulse didn't slow, it sharpened. The sheriff, a figure of authority in a place where authority had been compromised. She grabbed the duffel bag and held it close, taking several seconds to force her breathing to steady. Then she unlocked only the first chain and cracked the door slightly, just enough to see his face. Sheriff Dalton stood on the porch, his hat dripping with rain, his uniform immaculate despite the weather. His eyes surveyed her quickly, too quickly, taking in the suitcase behind her, the tension in her posture, the strain on her face. "Everything all right?" he asked. His tone was neutral, but his gaze pressed too deep. Emma tried to muster composure. "Fine," she lied. "Just getting ready to run some errands." He gave a small nod, tapping rain from his hat brim onto the porch. "We got some report," he began, voice steady, "about a break-in attempt here. Neighbors saw a vehicle parked near the fence line last night. Any idea who it was?" Her grip tightened around the bag. She opened her mouth, unsure whether full honesty was safe. "I heard something," she admitted cautiously. "Someone might have been on the property." "Why didn't you call?" he asked. "No cell service," she answered simply. His brow furrowed with faint surprise, as if he hadn't expected a practical explanation. He cleared his throat. "Look, this place has history. I'd be lying if I said your uncle didn't get himself involved with some folks best forgotten." The statement sounded rehearsed, too carefully phrased. Her instinct screamed that he knew more than he wanted to reveal. "If you find anything concerning anything at all, I need you to report it immediately," he added. The emphasis lingered unnervingly. Anything. She felt the threat behind the politeness. He was not here to protect her. He was here to assess how much she knew. Emma nodded, not trusting her voice. He held her gaze a moment longer, then tipped his hat and turned away. "Stay safe," he said over his shoulder before climbing back into his cruiser. The vehicle rolled down the gravel path slow enough that she realized he was giving himself time to look back if he wanted. Only when he turned onto the main road did she finally shut the door fully, locking it tight and bolting both chains. Her knees nearly gave out beneath her. Every instinct she possessed screamed that she couldn't leave now, not with the sheriff circling like a hawk, not until she secured duplicates of everything. If she drove to town with everything she had, she might never make it there alive. She spent the next hour planning for speed and silence. She prepared the old truck she'd found in the shed, checking fuel, testing the battery, and wiping clean the mud that had crusted the bumper. It was rugged, unimpressive, perfectly forgettable. A better bet than walking the long road alone. Before leaving for town, she knew she had to ensure that if anything happened to her, the truth wouldn't die with her. The idea made her stomach twist, but she moved, driven by the urgency that clung to her every motion. Back in the house, she spread papers across the floor. She divided the contents of the duffel bag, stashing duplicates in clever places, a hollow behind the kitchen cabinet, inside an old coffee tin buried in the pantry, beneath loose boards in her bedroom closet. Not perfect, but enough to slow anyone who came searching. She kept only what was needed to make a powerful first strike if intercepted. The flash drive, certain photos, and that most damning of diaries, her uncle's final ledger. The rain broke completely by mid-afternoon, clouds shredding apart to reveal a brighter sky. She took it as a sign, good or bad. She wasn't sure. With a deep breath, she gathered her courage and stepped outside. Her path to the truck was tense and cautious. She checked the driveway twice before getting in, locking the doors as quickly as she sat behind the wheel. The ignition coughed before turning over, loud enough that she winced. She eased the vehicle forward, afraid the sound might invite watchers. The ranch, once simply empty, now felt prowled. She kept checking the mirrors, scanning for that same dark pickup, or worse, the sheriff's cruiser returning without the courtesy of a knock. Miles ticked by slowly on the cracked road. Every bend felt like a trap. Every passing car sent her heart racing. She rehearsed 100 excuses in case she was stopped, though none felt believable enough to dissolve the suspicion hovering around her like fog. Finally, the small town came into view. She pulled into the grocery store's parking lot, a neutral, ordinary place, and took several moments to calm her trembling hands before heading inside. The public Wi-Fi loaded slowly, then held steady. She connected the flash drive to her laptop, tapping her fingers anxiously as folders appeared one by one. She didn't hesitate. She uploaded everything to encrypted cloud storage, copying files to multiple email drafts with different passwords. Then she sent partially redacted evidence to her own backup address, ensuring she had several ways of accessing it far from this computer. It took nearly an hour, but by the end, she felt something shift inside her. This time she had power too. Emma left the store quietly, avoiding eye contact with unfamiliar faces. She walked down the street toward the library, hoping to browse local archives or find newspaper records about her uncle. As she crossed the quiet main road, a familiar figure stepped out from behind a lamppost. The sheriff. Her heart seized. He greeted her with false warmth, too casual for someone who had come calling unannounced hours earlier. "Glad you made it to town," he said. His eyes flicked briefly toward her shoulder bag, too intentionally to be accidental. "What brings you here?" she managed. "Just making my rounds," he replied. "Small town, not many places to hide." A pause that stretched unnervingly long. "You look nervous." She forced a brittle smile. "Just tired. A lot to adjust to." He studied her closely, evaluating every movement, every breath. She held his gaze, refusing to flinch first. After a moment, he stepped back and nodded toward the library. "If you're curious about the ranch's history," he said, "ask for Mrs. Whitaker. She knows just about everything that ever happened in this county." His tone stiffened. "And some things that shouldn't have happened." Her skin prickled, sensing the layered warning beneath his tone. If he knew she had been digging, then someone else already knew too. As the sheriff walked away, casual yet watchful, Emma felt her fear not tighter, but also her resolve. If he represented the side trying to bury the truth, then she was doing exactly what terrified them most, uncovering it. Inside the library, she found the woman the sheriff mentioned, Mrs. Whitaker, an older librarian whose sharp eyes softened as soon as Emma asked about the ranch. She retrieved old clippings and property records without hesitation, though her hands trembled faintly as she laid them out. "He was a good man once," the librarian whispered, glancing warily toward the windows. "But some people don't let you stay good for long, especially when you know too much." She tapped one article. It spoke of a major drug investigation that collapsed years ago. Charges dropped, evidence missing. "That case disappeared," Mrs. Whitaker said. "Your uncle didn't." That damning echo lingered between them. As Emma gathered information, she realized she had underestimated the scale of what she was facing. Her uncle hadn't merely tracked a few criminals. He had stumbled into a network that spread further than she could imagine, reaching into every corner of the community. Men wearing badges, men signing checks, men in suits holding court downtown, all protecting one another in a silent pact. Now she knew why strangers cared so deeply about that barn. When she stepped back outside, the brightness of the afternoon seemed wrong, too calm for how the world now tilted. She quickened her pace toward the ranch, her senses heightened with every passing vehicle. Even the wind felt alert, shifting like an unseen presence changing position behind her. She drove home with the sun lowering behind the hills, the sky turning amber with threads of violet. The beauty of the moment only sharpened the dread that followed her through the gates and into the long driveway. The barn's silhouette waited like a sentinel or a snare. She parked and hurried inside the house, locking the door before she even set down the bag. She placed fresh printed copies of the most incriminating files in the metal box she'd found earlier, a safeguard within a safeguard. Evening crept in quickly, and once darkness settled, the ranch's isolation felt absolute. She stood at the window, staring toward the barn, when a flicker of motion caught her eye. A person's shadow moved briefly between the trees. The shape was gone a heartbeat later, but Emma had seen enough. Someone was watching again. She backed away from the window, adrenaline flooding her veins. She knew now that time was nearly gone. The truth she possessed was no longer merely dangerous. It had become a target painted on her back. She returned to the kitchen table, sliding her uncle's last note between her fingers, rereading the 5 words that anchored everything. Trust no one too quickly. She clung to that warning like a lifeline. The storm had arrived, no longer brewing but breaking open, and she understood something with frightening clarity. She was no longer just inheriting a legacy. She was being hunted by it. The safe still waited in the barn, sealed again, as silent as the danger closing in around her. But now she wasn't the same frightened stranger who first saw its shadow. She was a woman standing between secrets and those who killed to keep them hidden. And tomorrow, whether she was ready or not, those secrets would demand to be faced. Night returned like a shroud, thick and merciless. Emma sat at the small kitchen table, every document, photograph, and flash drive laid out before her like pieces of a puzzle no sane person would ever volunteer to solve. The lamplight trembled each time the wind pressed against the walls, as if the house itself were nervous. She tried to slow her breathing and failed. Her whole world had compressed to this single moment, to the forked path decision her uncle had left her holding. Walk away and survive, or confront a truth that could break not only her life, but the corrupted architecture of power wrapped around this town like a trap. Her phone flickered on the table beside her. No service, no lifeline, no easy escape. Her mind raced through everything she'd learned, every warning delivered through silence and stares. She knew patrols were circling. She knew the sheriff had assumed the role of watcher rather than protector. And she knew if she hesitated too long, those who wanted the files would grow impatient enough to take what they wanted by force. She could leave. She could pack light, slip away before dawn, disappear into anonymity, and pretend that this place had never existed. But the weight of the evidence pressed back against that impulse. Images of faces in the files, victims silenced, honest officers destroyed, missing people whose stories had ended in back alleys or shallow graves, rose into her thoughts like ghosts refusing to stay buried. If she left them behind too. A sound outside made her jump, a soft crunch of gravel. She snapped the lamp off, plunging the room into thick darkness, heart pounding so violently she feared its sound alone might expose her. She slunk toward the window and carefully peeled back a thin line in the curtain. Headlights cut through the dark, muted as the vehicle slowed near the gate. Not the sheriff's cruiser, not the truck she'd seen before. A different vehicle, sleek, black, unfamiliar. It stopped. The engine went silent. No doors opened. Someone was waiting. She backed away from the glass, breath trapped somewhere in her chest. Tonight was no longer a waiting game. Midnight had delivered the reckoning. She had to act now, or she would lose the power to act at all. Her eyes fell to the duffel bag. She stuffed it with everything irreplaceable. The flash drive, the most damning files, the note addressed to her. Then she moved to the bedroom, lifting the floorboard where she'd hidden a duplicate set. She grabbed that too. Every second her panic intensified, urging faster movements, quieter breaths. She needed to decide where to take the truth, who she could trust. Her uncle had left a small handwritten list tucked between the pages of one folder. Most names were crossed out. Only one remained untouched at the bottom. Special Agent Callum Drake, Federal Division HQ, Ravenwood City. Next to the name, her uncle had scribbled one final message. He tried to help once, didn't survive the attempt. If you go to him, go prepared. Someone once in the fight. Someone who had paid in blood. Emma didn't know if he was still alive, still trustworthy, still reachable. But he was the only name left who wasn't buried, missing, or part of the corruption. Her path, narrowing down from a maze into a single echoing road, pointed directly toward him. She zipped up the bag. Every inch of her body trembled, but adrenaline steeled her spine. She grabbed the truck keys from the counter and turned back toward the door. A loud bang shook the frame. She froze. The porch boards creaked under heavy boots. A man's voice, calm and cold, called out, "Miss Hayes, open up! This doesn't have to get messy. Her breath caught. Another voice joined in, lower, angrier. We know what you took. A slow dread flooded through her. More than one. Armed, close. She stepped back, eyes darting, searching for any route that didn't lead through the front door, the back exit, the kitchen window, the cellar. She thought wildly, half remembering the layout she had explored on her first day. Her mind caught on the old mudroom door that led to the yard behind the barn. Another thud against the front. The knob jiggled. A metallic scrape followed the sound of tools at work. No more time. She killed every light she'd forgotten to turn off, plunging the house into deep shadow. She slipped through the hallway, duffel bag slung tight against her, adrenaline clearing thought of hesitation. As she reached the mudroom, she heard the unmistakable crack of the front door splitting under force. Voices rushed inside. She twisted the back lock with shaking fingers and pulled the door open, slipping into the rain-soaked dark. Cold air slammed into her, sobering. She kept low, sprinting across grass toward the barn, mud streaking up her legs. The wind drowned the sound of her pounding footsteps, but her heart still felt loud enough to betray her. Behind her, flashlights swept through the house's windows. Men shouted her name. The nightmare she had imagined had arrived. Breathing, searching, hunting. She slipped into the barn and shut the door just enough to hide the movement without making noise. The cavernous dark inside felt alive, shadows crawling up the walls. The safe loomed, a dark monolith she could sense rather than see. She forced herself to the corner where she had stashed basic supplies and grabbed the heavy crowbar she'd used to force entry days before. How long ago that seemed now. One flashlight beam flashed across the barn's outside wall. They were moving toward her. She swallowed a whimper and crouched behind a stack of crates, pressing her back hard against the wood. The duffel bag felt like a dead weight. If they cornered her inside this barn, they would take everything. They would make her disappear like every truth-teller before. The barn door began to slide open. The screech of metal on metal scraped through the night. Boots stepped in, her lungs clamped shut, refusing another breath as she listened to the footsteps. One man, then another. They moved slowly, searching between stacks of hay, workbenches, forgotten machinery. The beam of a flashlight shot across the ceiling, painting hunting circles of light. She would not survive if she waited here. Something inside her, some raw instinct she didn't recognize, took control. She scanned the barn, eyes adjusting to the shifting lights. She saw the side ladder leading to the loft, boards that creaked but might hold her weight. Above, a small window near the roof offered a narrow escape. She had no better choice. Holding breath hostage in her chest, she crept toward the ladder while their lights pointed in the opposite direction. Each rung groaned faintly beneath her shoes, the wood fatigued by age. Just as she reached the loft, a flashlight suddenly swung her way. Too close. Reflex seized her limbs. She ducked flat against the boards, body pressed tight to the rough surface. The beam glided just below the loft's edge, missing her by inches. Her heart slammed so hard she feared her ribs would crack. The men's voices drifted upward. She's in here somewhere. We should check the house again. If we find the files, the girl won't matter. Files, not Emma. The truth was the threat, not her existence. A new terror rose inside her, a grief she didn't expect. Her life meant nothing to them, but the legacy she carried, that was worth killing for. The men split directions, one closer, one farther. The one near the ladder swayed his light upward again, and this time, for a fraction of a second, he caught a glimpse of motion. There! He shouted. Emma bolted up, grabbing the rafter for leverage. She sprinted, half-crawled across the boards toward the window. Below, steps thundered as one man climbed after her, ladder trembling violently. She shoved the window with all her weight. It stuck, swollen with years of storms. She slammed her shoulder again. The glass fractured. Again, it burst outward, shards slicing through the air. She didn't hesitate. She launched through the opening. The fall knocked breath from her lungs, the ground slamming into her side. Pain exploded, white and sharp, but fear forced her back to her feet. She clutched the bag and stumbled into the open yard. Shouts behind her, boots pounding, lights growing. She raced toward the truck, skidding down the slope. The keys bit into her palm as she swung into the driver's seat. Her hands shook too violently at first to fit the key properly. A scream of frustration escaped her as she forced it in. The engine fired. Headlights snapped on. Men spilled from the barn entrance. Guns raised, beams snapping onto her silhouette in the windshield. She slammed the accelerator. The truck lurched forward, tires spitting mud and gravel as she tore down the driveway, heart pounding in her throat. A gunshot cracked behind her, then another. She flinched, but the truck kept going. She didn't look back. The world narrowed to the trembling road ahead. She didn't breathe again until the ranch lay far behind, swallowed by darkness. Only then did she allow a broken sob to escape. The reality hit her with devastating force. She was no longer running from the unknown. She was fleeing people who believed she held their doom. Tears blurred the road, but she didn't slow. Far ahead, the faint highway lights beckoned toward Ravenwood City, toward Special Agent Drake, toward the only remaining hope of surviving this truth. The duffel bag sat heavy on the seat beside her, the weight of justice, danger, consequence. Her uncle had chosen her for a reason, and whether she felt ready or not, she had accepted his legacy. There was no turning back, not now, not ever. If this story shocked you, make sure to subscribe and turn on the notifications. You don't want to miss what happens next. Watch our other videos for more unbelievable true stories and share this one with someone who needs to see it.